Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming for our event. We had a little bit delay. We have camera crew here from our local channel. We got a little bit of information, and I'm happy to introduce you, Miss Andrea Stoyan-Karadelli. Andrea has been active very much all her life, and she speaks 6 languages, and she has a unique experience. She has been to Romania, Turkey, and in Eastern Europe, and she was actually in Syria right before the civil war started. And she has interesting educational background from law degree that she didn't complete, but she took all the courses which I learned today, and to criminal justice, and to political science and security studies, and history. She has been attending the history conferences with us. And this is the beauty of this experience. She was able to combine them all together, to analyze and come up with something, and that we can all benefit. And we will be happy to listen to her talk about especially the role of the religious communities in our modern world. All right, please welcome Andrea.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tamer, for such a nice introduction. We always find new things about each other, right? Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. And I would first like to express my gratitude and my appreciation to the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley for bringing me here and for making this event possible. It is definitely a pleasure to be in front of you today. Since an early age, I've been traveling all over the world, moving from one place to another, and being able to adapt easily to any kind of social or geographical environment. But in every place that I've been to, I realized one thing, and that's the power of a united community. In the recent years, after studying the history, the languages, the culture, the politics of the Middle East, I dedicated my research, and especially my PhD thesis, to a subject that, unfortunately, is more and more contemporary and vivid every day: terrorism. More exactly, I've been looking at the way in which normal people like me and you get seduced by the terrorist organizations and dragged into terrorist attacks. And you know, I think you all wonder what's the relation between the power of a united community and terrorism. See, that's what I'm going to try to explain today through this community. But let me first start by an analogy that I've made yesterday at the beginning of my presentation for the International Symposium of Middle East Relations. I would like to share that with you. I compared terrorism with a disease that took 3 dear people from my life, and I'm sure that disease took dear people from your lives as well, and that's cancer. You might think that the analogy comes from the fact that both cancer and terrorism take many lives every year. Yes, you might be right, but actually, the reason hidden behind my analogy is a bit deeper. A short research into the causes of cancer and a talk with a famous oncologist back in my home country made me realize that the way in which cancer cells appear and develop is by having an acidic environment. They can only feed, develop, evolve in an acidic environment. Actually, in the same way, terrorism appears and develops in acidic environments. I mean, in societies and states that lack stability and security, that have no respect towards human rights and human values, societies that have been through armed conflicts and unrest. As we know how those two come to life, cancer and terrorism, how can we actually make this process be reversed? For cancer, it's actually very easy. You make the environment pretty alkaline and the cancer starts to die, or the cancer cells start to die. However, when it comes to terrorism, the alkaline environment is pretty hard to be defined. But in fact, the harder it is to be defined, the easier it is to make an analogy again with the power of a united community. The main idea, this is the time when I would like to emphasize the main idea that I'd like you to leave from here with, is that the united we stand, the more value, love, and respect we give to each other, the stronger we get, and the weaker they become. But firstly, let me give you some information about they, about people who are destroying our world today. There is actually no perfect definition of terrorism, but all the definitions that I've come upon throughout my research got some common points. Terrorism is a serious crime that is perpetrated with the intent of causing death or serious bodily injury or the taking of hostages. And that it is committed for the purpose of provoking state of terror in the general public or in a group of individuals or particular individuals, intimidating the population or compelling a government or an international organization to carry out or to abstain from carrying out any act. This is a very academic definition, but in my own personal opinion, I think terrorism is a crime against humanity, against every single person living in any corner of the world, because although we might forget sometimes, me and you, we may not speak the same language, we may not pray the same way, or we may not like the same things. But in fact, we are still more connected and more interdependent than we can think about. And this is how terrorism happening anywhere, in any corner of the world, in any state in the world, actually is a crime against us alone, is a crime against our shared values as human beings. And terrorism, because I'm sure you all agree with me, should not be ever associated with any nationality, religion, or ethnicity. As regarding terrorist radicalization, that's a process, a very complicated process, a very tricky one. It's a process whereby an individual comes to accept terrorist violence as possible, even perhaps legitimate. I know it sounds crazy. It's a course of action. This may eventually, but not necessarily, lead this person to advocate, act in support of, or engage in terrorism. Terrorist radicalization may occur in a great variety of circumstances, in different ways and at different speeds. Each case of terrorist radicalization and recruitment for terrorism results from the unique intersection of an enabling environment with the personal circumstances and psychology of a given man or woman. As countries try to define or to find more effective means of preventing terrorism, greater efforts are made to determine why and how individuals turn to terrorism in the first place, so that they can prevent it earlier on. Unfortunately, and this makes my own research a bit more complicated and challenging at the same time, there is no single profile of a terrorist, no clear cut for the pathway towards terrorism. There are possible drivers of terrorist radicalizations, but those are varied and complex, and they combine in such a unique way that every single case becomes unique. There are a variety of structural conditions of a social, economic, and political nature that can possibly push individuals towards terrorism, such as discrimination and other forms of human rights violations, relative deprivation, a lack of access to education, poverty, and so on. But they are not themselves sufficient to account for terrorist radicalization. It is important to take into account other factors, such as psychological or interpersonal or ideological nature, to explain mobilization. And this is what I'm trying to do throughout my research. In other words, it is important to understand that us, as human beings, we are continuously defined by our experiences, by every single moment in our lives. Events that we might consider unimportant might eventually affect us unconsciously and can even influence the biggest decisions in our lives. Those people that we see on TV that don't bomb themselves, they might become terrorists without even knowing about it. without even realizing it. Such factors or such events can help explain why one particular individual might follow a path of terrorist radicalization, while another from a comparable situation and background may not. Psychological and cognitive factors such as one's self-image, a sense of identity and belonging, expectations, beliefs, and attitudes are dynamic and shape down a person's experiences and react to his or her environment and events. They can have an impact on the development of negative feelings of displacement, of being odd or feeling odd. For instance, feelings of exclusion, rejection, relative deprivation, humiliation, victimization, and injustice, frustration, revolt, or even superiority. This can push someone to be more susceptible to the appeal of terrorism. And unfortunately, throughout my research, I realized that youth have often proven more vulnerable to terrorist propaganda as they grapple with questions of identity and their place in the world, or their place at school, or the problems they have with their families. You know, youth can be very complicated. They are more inclined to the risks and to the challenge of the status quo. Psychological susceptibility can also be suddenly and dramatically increased as a result of trauma caused by a triggering event that acutely affects a person. You might wonder why I'm explaining all this to you. It is because as a community we become stronger when we know what we're actually fighting against. And this is where the religious communities play an important role in caring for their members, for the events that happen in their members' lives. Like an extended, or I know you might say over and over, extended family. However, it is the first step towards creating the alkaline environment that I was telling you about at the start of my presentation, and protecting the healthy cells from the spread of and exposure to ideas and narratives that legitimize terrorism and foster its appeal. Many terrorists and violent extremists skillfully tailor, package, and disseminate their narratives in a way that will reach and resonate with a particular individual or group targeted for radicalization and recruitment. There are actually a number of approaches, different approaches, that can be used to provide legitimacy and enhance the appeal of terrorism. And these include using the logic that the ends justify the means, arguing that violence is a necessity in the pursuit of an imperative social, ideological, political, or other goal, and that there is no alternative. Dehumanizing intended victims on the basis of intolerance, hate, and denial of universal human dignity. Presenting terrorism as something exciting, countercultural, anti-establishment, as it happens in Palestine. Building on the charisma and or perceived legitimacy of terrorists, and in particular, their leaders. Social interactions, group dynamics, and interpersonal relationships play a primary role as pull factors, except in instances of self-directed or self-initiated radicalization, which becomes more and more popular nowadays as we can see the syndrome of the lone wolf. People are drawn into terrorist propaganda through personal acquaintances like peers and relatives, or they are sought out by terrorist recruiters. Terrorist recruiters identify, prey on, and groom vulnerable men and women. They gain a hold on them by providing material or psychological support and abuse their trust to manipulate them into, or indoctrinate them into becoming involved with terrorism. In fact, there is always a local dimension to terrorism. It always happens somewhere, or whether it is the place where the terrorists hide, or the place where the terrorists live, or where they find support and operate, or they attack, or when an individual or a group becomes more and more involved with terrorism. There is a local approach to preventing terrorism, and that is therefore necessary. In trying to better allocate resources and improve effectiveness of the action against terrorism, states have sought to identify where to concentrate their efforts. And they got one best solution. Communities have increasingly emerged as the point of focus in the formulation and implementation of counterterrorism policies. That's because terrorism, as we hear about it nowadays on TV, on social media, is a threat to the public at large, and therefore to all communities, especially to the religious communities. Acts of terrorism not only impact communities and their members, but terrorists also need and seek support, sympathizers, and recruits from the public to be able to carry out their plans. A number of states have therefore sought to put the community at the center of their counterterrorism policies and measures, and to develop community-based approaches with a particular emphasis on prevention and development of partnership with the public. But what's actually a community-oriented approach to counterterrorism? It can actually be characterized by partnerships based on trust between communities and public authorities. It can be characterized by community support for involvement in and the formulation of and implementation of and evaluation of various strategies, policies and measures. And it is also characterized by counterterrorism being framed and pursued in relation to community safety concerns rather than state security. Community-oriented policies and measures for countering terrorism recognize and emphasize the role of the public at large, individual people, particular communities and their members, community-based organizations, and other civil society and private sector organizations in general, making them active stakeholders in counterterrorism, giving them power to fight against terrorism. These stakeholders need to be encouraged and empowered to contribute to countering terrorism, in particular with regard to prevention, preparedness, first response, and recovery. Community-based approaches rely on the notion that the security of a community is closely interlinked with a degree of cohesion and resilience of the community. Cohesion refers to the extent to which people bond around shared values and goals, around shared interests, and develop mutual understanding and a sense of collective identity and belonging, resulting in the building of mutual trust. That is what makes a community strong. Cohesion may lead to forms of collective mobilization, with individuals being prepared to pull together and intervene to address common problems for the public good. Higher levels of community cohesion are linked to significantly lower rates of crimes such as robbery, assault, street crime, and other sources of individual violent victimization. And this is where the state has an important role to play in creating, encouraging, and sustaining cohesion among all communities and societies. It can do so by promoting a sense of identity that is both credible and enduring, as well as being sufficiently fluid so that it can easily embrace a wide range of freedoms for all individuals on the territory of the state. And this is the way in which states understand that community support cannot be assumed. Community support must be won. To mitigate the threats from political violence and terrorism, a multi-pronged strategy that brings together a multiplicity of actors from law enforcement, security, community leaders, and stakeholders within the community that really focuses on training, outreach, and partnership is the most required strategy. Built on the foundations of understanding the current and emerging threats, the ability for agencies and institutions to improve training, to explore platforms to educate the community against terrorism and extremism, and expand partnership through a multitude of networks, will ensure the formation of an effective security framework against terrorism and extremism. And that's because we can only take a network to defeat a network. Terrorists recruit from the community, in particular individuals from the community who are sympathetic to their cause. Broadly, it is the public and the community at large whose hearts and minds that governments are trying to win over and to build structures of trust, understanding and education against terrorism and extremism who will make the ultimate difference against it. Disasters such as terrorist attacks can be the new normal in the current century if we never take actions as a whole. There is a strong need to have a keener awareness of the threat we face, greater ability to withstand and survive the disruptions we can't avoid, and needs a deeper commitment and broader capacity to resume functioning so we don't suffer debilitating loss or collapse. The resilience and resolve of the network within the community will act as a shield by inoculating the community against the virulent terrorist networks that are affecting communities. These very community networks will simultaneously lay the foundations within the community, empowering them with the necessary social structures that will ensure that the social fabric of the community remains unaltered in times of turmoil and adversity. The community as a network of individuals that work towards the safety and security of the collective will act as a vanguard to mitigate both the threats and the ensuing impact of terrorism and extremism in the community. And this is a step-by-step process. At the first stage, it is the community involvement. We all need to get involved in the fight against terrorism. The community realizes the necessity to fight against it, against terrorism and extremism, and all the individuals get involved in this fight in many ways. At the second stage, it is the community engagement. This stage typically involves the role of government partnership or community stakeholders who are there able to engage with individuals on related issues, in this case terrorism and radicalization. And the third stage, maybe the most important one, it is the establishment of the goal of community resilience. Resilience is in turn defined as a process linked a set of adaptive capacities to a positive trajectory of functioning and adaptation after a disturbance. Hence, after successful engagement programs between the governments and communities, and additionally even amongst communities on their own accord, community resilience is eventually achieved. I know it might sound like a paradox, but among all types of communities, the religious communities hold the greatest power to get united and fight against terrorism by defending them using their own rhetoric, but in the right way. No religion, correct me if I'm wrong, but no religion promotes violence or crime. No religion tells you to go and bomb yourself and kill thousands of people. And no religion tells you to take your own life or someone else's life. Instead, religions promote love and respect, care for each other, and peace. All religions tell us that God gave us one important commandment: to love each other. The landscape of terrorism is both volatile and constantly evolving. In combating the threat of terrorism, academics and policymakers alike need to continuously reassess the threat of terrorism. This can be a very complicated process, with everything evolving every single day. The asymmetric threat posed by terrorists is never static, unfortunately. Terrorists constantly respond to the environment within which they operate. They adapt, like the cancer cells. Given the ability of terrorists to adapt to counterterrorism measures put in place, the measures undertaken by counterterrorism community need to adapt to the dynamics and evolving threat. Sound knowledge of the enemy is quite essential for the creation of both an efficient and effective response to the threat. And all of us, as religious communities, we need to get our members more united than ever, to care for every one of them as if it was ourselves, to try to understand and know each other better, to see what's happening in our and others' lives, to be able to notice when something goes wrong and immediately react. You know, yesterday, while I was doing my other presentation, after I presented, I got a question from one of the students. She asked me what we as individuals can do. The best answer that I could think about was to give up ignorance, was to turn on the news and realize that something that happens in another corner of the world can actually happen anywhere close to us as well and affects us as well. And then we can go help. We can help from here. We can help within our communities. We can help raise awareness on over what is happening in the other corner of the world. And then we can also help by understanding that arms and war are not the solution to defend terrorism, as chemotherapy is not a treatment for cancer. We just end up destroying ourselves and destroying our world. everyone here, and I'm sure religious communities would definitely agree with me, creating a heaven here within our communities, helping the people whose homes and lives have been affected by terrorism through whatever means we have, and putting an end to ignorance would eventually create the alkaline environment that will kill the cancer of our world today, terrorism. Thank you.